There we go. Okay, it's five-ish, and I will stop yakking at about six. Because I sort of wanted to finish off the welcome to this and that. We started technically at five, but we're now almost at 5:30. We were looking at some other things, how we're going to conduct some of the other things related to us. A semester with the Class Unity Group, a former subgroup of the Democratic Socialists of America. And I wanted to finish off today. The primary thing I wanted to talk about was to finish off yakking about Hegel. Not that we're going to do Hegel in 30 minutes. I advised folks from the last time to look at the little brief 17-minute description of philosophically how to look at Hegel, and which I find a very good 17. If there can be 17-minute introduction to Hegel, that's as good as any. The second video that I put in was one that fills in the gap that the first one presents on Hegel, with a further description of the kind of circuitry, as it were, the circularity, the motion, as it were, of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Not that it condenses it, but it does give you a sense of how, if you're going to think about Hegel, you certainly do have to, and think eventually about the phenomenology of spirit, which is the sort of the big text, but not as easy to read. In fact, as Hegel's Encyclopedia, which in itself is kind of a bit of a slog. All of these things, I think, help us with a certain brand of idealism that points toward the integration by Marx of materialism as dialectical materialism. And so these matters can be merged together as Marx does. One sub-element of this, of course, a function of a kind of realism, are a further subgroup, which is followed by some materialists, and that is varieties of realism. There's a realism that is certain scientists believe in a certain kind of realism, that we have only one true reality that can be made empirical. There is a sub-branch, it's at Roy Bhaskar, critical realism, that there are some multiple realities, but common features. That is the assumption that there are some empirically scientific realities out there, but we construct a variety of versions of this, which is important, particularly because of the common features. And so that's our questions before a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of days ago, however long it was, when we were talking about Zizek on the commons, is kind of a reflection on common features. So if you're talking about an actual commons, that is a commons in which politics happens, or governance happens, or governmentality happens, you would need to appeal to some things that are common to a variety of disciplines, as it were. And the third area, which is problematic for some folks, because you could say, particularly some people who have a preference for certain types of science, let's put it that way, is social constructionism, which manifests itself in a variety of disciplines, but is problematically framed, even though it's Berger and Locke and blah blah blah. For some people, it's too relativistic, and so, on the one hand, social constructivism allows for discussions of identity, politics, intersectionality, and a whole bunch of other things. It tends to a certain kind of relativism, which can be problematic. So I like thinking that in asserting a kind of critical realism, that we can sort of look at the common elements, but also appeal to certain structural elements that are also equally important, so that you can have a portal gun, but not necessarily believe in it. So that's my little idea about that look back at Hegel. So I provided, as I said, two brief videos, Hegel in 17 minutes, a brief diagram of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. And you do need kind of diagrams to get through Hegel. I mean, you sort of have to see, well, what does he mean by this? And are there ways in which we can talk about gaining knowledge, categorizing the world, that allow us to, achieve that kind of degree of consciousness. So it is a commentary on this. And so I think this guy gives a fairly good example of that. And then there's sort of someone trying to cope with Zizekism. This is Zizek, if you don't remember what he looks like. So I'm not going to rehearse what we're going to look at, but there are issues about syllogisms and judgments that do have logical implications. I closed yesterday by sort of trying to give you a sense that it's important to look at Chris Arthur. I include his presentation, it's 30 minutes, on the article above, that's in its entirety. So as a presentation, it's shorter. And maybe more to the point when you hear him talk in his own tonality, sort of as an utterance, his own emphases on doing it. But essentially, he's reading from the text, but he sort of skips around or skips forward and excludes certain things. And so in that sense, this video, if you're of a mind to listen to multitask, it is fairly coherent. Now, the point I want to make about why bother with Hegel is that Hegel gives you a multi-layered kind of approach to problems of being and of essence, of things, of working through what appears to us and what is. And so it is a integrated process, one that has a dialectical movement. And this is from Hegel's dialectics in the Plato philosophy site at Stanford. And it's a diagram. But this idea of relation, or maybe Aufhebung, or whatever, is a process of passing back and forth between the something others, which may seem a little confusing, but it is this idea that we have a kind of dialogic, or we dialogue with the world. We have these kinds of discourse, conversations, and not only do we have them in reality, but we have them in our little brains, which sounds a little schizophrenic, but that's kind of where it goes. Now, the whole big picture for Hegel is this notion of and in fact, it's useful to invoke Hegel, not just simply because he's building on Fichte, and that you can imply that it has something to do with Frege when you start moving forward into language stuff. But lest you think that's unimportant, it's sort of this little Frege thing is actually the front end of where we get to Chomsky on transformational grammar. But anyway, so imagine that things that we don't see, or that there are these finite, and this is from a Frege thing interpretation, that is, that you would have a universe of concepts, and there are a finite number of them. Not that you could ever assess all the finite numbers, but you sort of assume that in a positivistic sort of way, well, there might be a finite number of concepts. And this would resemble, from a lexicon or language point of view, that, there's all these words in our conceptual lexicon that we can pick from and pick and choose. The problem, of course, comes when we generate ideas. That is, concepts can be used to generate ideas no differently than language can be used to generate utterances or sentences, and I don't want to get into the linguistics of it, but the fact is there's there's certain grammar to all of this, and the structure of that grammar is one that raises interesting Hegelian questions or problems. That's kind of what Chomsky, since we're worried there, or we're waiting for Chomsky to pass away, is the initial problem for Chomsky, And what he got his funding from the government from initially was the idea of universal translators, which we're getting there, right, with AI, and right, we're sort of on the brink in some ways. And I know that it has all kinds of issues. So setting that aside for the moment, the idea of a universal translator was really important in the 1950s. And government money was being spent on these kind of area studies problems that it would make our job of keeping an eye on the Soviet Union a lot easier, et cetera, et cetera. So the part of the general decryption, espionage stuff that goes on in our government. So if you were thinking about a kind of grammar and a certain model for how you would create a universal translator, you might think that, well, maybe there's these rules, and then, if you hold to the rules, and then you can generate, a kind of infinite number of sentences, which is what you can do with the English language. Now, whether they make any sense or not is the next question. Is if you just put random things in together, that is, with a certain structure that is subject, predicate, object, blah, blah, blah. You could generate sentences, but they might not make any damn sense. On the other hand, what's poetry about anyway? So you want to get into the suggestions of what you're going to get out of this. So the idea, in the Hegelian sense, has these elements to it. It has something that has to do with reality, that is nature. It has a certain structure or logic, and it has, other stuff, morals, ethics, something. And so spirit, nature, and logic is one way in which our German friend Hegel is sort of thinking about, well, maybe we can, make a kind of a dictionary, an encyclopedia out of all these things, and sort of work out how all these things fit together, knowing, of course, that getting a handle on all of these things really requires probably too much heavy duty thinking. But I would assert to you that much of what we do in a university is to try and parse out some of these elements, and Hegel just simply gives us a guide, one guide among many, to sort of approaching all these problems. And you can see in this particular diagram here, it's, it has a Kantian element to it, but God's not there. I mean, God could be there, but, it kind of difficult. There's this other kind of idea going on here, and maybe it's not so much about God, but it's about spirit. So, and what's that about? So you can see that it has a material possibility there, and I think that you can see how Marx himself was sort of attracted to that kind of structure, that we could look at questions of being and essence. We could work through, how it is we could approach the Hegelian goal, as it were, of absolute ideas, as opposed to the kind of relativism, and kind of fight out all these things, whether it's in physics or anthropology or law or art. All of those things are still at work. You can see some of that flavor of these Hegelian ideas in the earlier Marx, that is in the Grundrisse, for example, before, we get to the Critique and to Capital and blah, blah, blah. So you don't want to get too tied up in it, but Hegel, a complex thinker, needless to say. And from a Marxian point of view, you can organize his ideas into ways in which we can get at, questions of language, questions of utterance, questions of discourse, etc. So what I did was I included, because for the reasons that we were looking at it before, and because of that little 17-minute video, is that thinking about the science of logic. And yes, there's the lesser and the greater science of blah, blah, blah. But science of logic does have these three divisions, being, essence, and concept, or idea, which, we know that concept and idea are interchangeable. What I've given you at first, via Frege, is the idea that a concept is a finite thing, and that there are the possibility of an infinite number of ideas that are possible with concepts. So this suggests that with our grammar, and initially, for example, a phrase structure grammar, could become a transformational grammar, which is Chomsky, and we could get to, sort of universals at some moment, which is kind of where we're going with AI and searching. But anyway, for most of the 20th century, it's not received with the enthusiasm that often marked the reception of phenomenology of spirit. First, as a work of logic, most have regarded the science of logic as a radically outdated and relying on an Aristotelian approach that was definitely surpassed in the later 19th century, particularly when you get to logical positivism, Bertrand Russell, etc. Lest you think that's unimportant, it is the bridge between Russell and then Wittgenstein and all the other business going on here that's really actually pretty important for 20th century thought. Thus, many readers sympathetic to particular doctrines in Hegel have attempted, contrary to Hegel's insistence, to quarantine his philosophical approach to particular areas from it. Recently, this skepticism has started to change. In other words, there was a bias for the phenomenology because of its connection to other psychology kind of developments, particularly in the area of Western European phenomenology, that is the phenomenology of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, among others. Anyway, some advocate that the science of logic be read as a first-order ontological doctrine, don't worry too much about that, or as a category theory that simultaneously represents structures of being and thought. Kind of that's what we've worried about. That's what Marx worries about. And so it's having very little to do with what has traditionally been known as logic. Logic, as we normally think of it, just an aside, as ultimately being very math-like or very algorithm-like or symbolic in that sense. So there's an entire literature on not only formal but informal logic. The informal logic is simply the ordinary language version of a highly mathematical, or at least math-looking symbolic logic, and made problematic, of course, by the rise of the computer, etc. Others argue that in contrast to the project of formal or general logic, it is best understood as a version of what Kant had called transcendental logic. In this sense, it should be thereby be thought of as a successor, that is, Hegel's logic is a successor to Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories in the Critique of Pure Reason, in which Kant attempted to derive a list of those non-empirical concepts, the categories. It's an idealism in that sense, which he believed to be presupposed by all empirical judgments made by finite discursive knowers like ourselves. Now, this doesn't even address the question, other Kantian questions, which are important for us still. For example, the sublime, which is, the sublime is really important for those of us who do, certain types of critical judgments, aesthetic judgments, let's put it that way, or critique of judgment that Kant presents, which is really important for getting at, as we've looked at elsewhere, about rational theories of justice or law. So all of those things are still intertwined. Okay, back to the text. In short, taking the logic as a category theory opens up two general lines of interpretation. Should the categories be understood as primarily ontological categories, as found in Aristotle, or as primarily categories revealing the necessary structure of thought, as in Kant? Those, such as the advocates of the revised metaphysical interpretation, interpreting Hegel as basically a metaphysician, typically stress the former, while post-Kantian interpreters typically stress the latter. So you can see this kind of division of labor looking at all these complicated things. So there is the triadic, the table of contents of the science of logic actually has this little thing here, this triadic structuring among the categories or thought determinations discussed that have been noted among the shapes of consciousness in the phenomenology. In other words, Hegel is talking about these things as elements of how we express our consciousness, and we do that every day when we yak at each other. So at the highest level of its branching structure, there are the three books devoted to the doctrines of, I'm going to stop with this in a second, being, essence, and concept, while in turn, each book has three sections, each, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, Hegel's categorical triads appear to repeat Kant's own triadic way of articulating the categories in the table of categories, that is the one from Critique of Pure Reason, in which the third term in the triad in some way integrates the first two. This is kind of what Marx is driving at. That is, you have this kind of interdetermination, and yet you get to the third transformation. That is, to use the cliche, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But remember that Marx also talks about sublation, the Aufgehoben, in the third. While the first two are negated by the third, they continue to work within the context defined by it. Remember, that's what critical theory tries to give us, the negation of the negation, right? This is not nihilism at work, but rather this is trying to get to some better knowledge from a certain type of logical procedure. So anyway, and this is from the Stanford text, but you want to think of the category as this kind of approach to having a universal, like dinners. There are particularities at work, like the salad course. And so you can think of the syllogism as kind of purpose, particularity, and singularity. That is, so dinner, salad, lettuce. Not everything can be seen that way, but I think you can see how our consciousness of the world is kind of like that. You have a paragraph, a sentence, and maybe individual words. You have these kinds of hierarchies, this order. And so our logic is a way of trying to put all these stupid things together. And so without getting into the further thing, I find the Stanford dictionary or encyclopedia of philosophy actually quite useful. It allows us to look at this big thing, nature, logic, and spirit, in a way that kind of connects all these things together without worrying about the hierarchy. But it is an important hierarchy because it has a certain order to it. So anyway, that's by way of saying we can get to value. Ultimately, we can get to some idea of value, and we can also achieve that by, in one sense, looking at labor. Now, if we were just thinking about language, we could think of it as a kind of labor theory of value. And I know that may seem a little alien to you, but there is this idea that you are producing speech, right? You're blurting noise out of your face, and it has a certain cognitive relation to what's going on up in your brain. And for people, those of us who are getting older and achieving, craziness or dementia or something, Alzheimer's, whatever, we have, short circuits in these kinds of relations. And so therefore, we may be thinking of a really important idea, but it gets screwed up by the time it gets out of our mouth. So I hope that you can see these kinds of, they're not perfect hierarchies, and they're not rigid, and we know so damn little still about some of these things. So, but these are at work. And so it is even a kind of cultural, language is a kind of cultural production process in that same sense. And without going into the literature, you can argue that the first languages, that is the languages, Neanderthal language, or the emergence in an anthropological way of the evolution of language, does have all these kinds of weird little elements in it. And of course, we do primate studies in order to teach, animals various connections of things. And yes, it is quite possible to have parrots or, apes or whatever to, convey language-like things or completely language-like orientations, and even utter them. But that's another interesting idea. But anyway, that's another different lecture. The idea for money, of course, is that this kind of going back and forth is about these kinds of ways in which money can serve that kind of purpose in order to get to value. Value is just another thing that arrives kind of at a kind of meta level, but it always comes back to the concrete. So my way of trying to explain value as a concept, and this is Chris Arthur's stuff, combining UPS, that is universality, particularity, and singularity, it occurs in single moments, that is moments of action or activity. And he did that in his little diagram that resolves itself down to the thing that's worth 3 pounds. this thing here. And in terms of making this intelligible to you, this can be, and with all due respect to the way I do stupid analogies and metaphors, anytime we buy something, or buy food, to be even more specific about it, we've got this kind of, some things we just don't think about, right? It's going to taste good. It's going to fill my stomach. It's going to stop me from punching somebody in the face. All of those things. And we sort of resolve them down to other things. So when we're looking at the menu, for example, we think about well, how much is this going to cost? And it's not a prefix menu. And, and if you're eating with someone at a restaurant, you have, is this, is the fact that I'm choosing meat going to piss off the person I'm eating supper with because they're vegan, blah, 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 blah. So you have all these other elements going on. And so even though you assess the price at one level, you actually assess the values kind of at a similar but different level. So all of these things are going on at the same time. So, what Hegel's trying to do is say, well, it is just one action, but it's got all these other things, and it will have all these other things relative to the larger question of other matters, right? How much is the tip? Do you need to divide the tip? Do I have enough money for car fare? Blah, blah, blah. All of those things. So I just wanted to introduce this idea because this is exactly the same thing that goes on with Marx's discussion of value form, which, takes up far too much ink and time in the Marxist theory, but I think it's important to think about it. That is, you have all these other things that comprise a problematic element of value, but they're still important because they do affect not only how you do exchanges or how capital is distributed, but also what gets to be produced. So you have all of these complex things going on, and it seems kind of overwhelming, but, when you think about it, and you've got all these Germans working on it, it seems to have a certain kind of order to it. And you can see how Marx in the middle of the 19th century sort of thinking about this. Well, there's an orderly way to think about it. What goes on, and I'm, he's observing Engels' textile works at the same level. And you're going, oh, yeah, well, he gets all this yarn from this, and then, this other stuff occurs, and, it's worth thinking about, especially when other people are not thinking about it more seriously, which is what his critique of Smith and Ricardo are about. And then you begin to think about it in broader and more complex terms that have to deal with stuff like transitivity and other stuff. And so the second diagram, because I'm going to stop in a second, you can see that there are other, as I've referred to them, as a kind of set of nested sets or circuits that is in volume 2 of Capital, because we're going to get back to Capital eventually, whether we do it this way or with the class unity meetings. We're going to look at successive moments of circuitry. So where we go from C to C prime to C double prime, and at all. This is in volume 2 of Capital. And the whole point in all of this is to express the idea that there is a mediating relationship that money has that is not trivial and in fact very essential and important. And it's part of this whole circuitry question, but you can't exclude it from the process. So there's this whole kind of thing that's working on here that is not fully satisfied by, for example, metallic equivalents like gold or whatever. So all that is there. You'll see a version of this progressive or successive, let's put it that way, thing in volume 2 of Capital. And so these are emergent properties of the exchange system to be closer to. And so even though it's Hegelian, it's still, and you don't have to use Hegel, and you don't have to talk about Hegel much, but it does have all the structural elements in it. And so ultimately this shows, as Chris Arthur resolves to the point at the end, simply to be itself, capital must become ever larger. This is the explanation of why growth occurs because of these successive motions, movement. Capital is money in motion. And what I keep on yakking about before, it's not about things, it's about motion. And it doesn't resolve everything to call it, to make the analogy to the physical sciences, but, those concepts are not always just simply about physical motion. And so I have argued that the categories of Hegel's logic may be deployed in understanding the nature of capital because material practice has generated a model of Hegel's logic of the concept. Here, I have concentrated attention on just a part of this homology. That is, these are homologous. That is, they have a similar structure. I have shown how the formal moments of the concept, big C, map onto the form of price. See, price is another way of talking about this, and it's the problematic of value. Now, in what I did, two mistakes were avoided. Number one, the naturalistic reduction of form to matter. So form is an abstract version of matter. Number two, the supposition that value is a mental fiction generated in social consciousness. So this is the veil problem, that it's only an aberration in your brain. The point in being a good materialist, good Marxist, is to say, well, it's not just illusory, because people actually do stuff. They act on it. I walk into this store. My procedure is not to look at things that are on sale, but to look at things that are on clearance, because things that are on clearance violate the price value problem. And so you wonder, well, are they just recovering a cost? Are they just clearing inventory? What reasons did they put this on clearance? And is it a deal for me relative to the wealth I want to expand? So you think of value in other ways. I think of it anyway in other ways, not because simply I'm cheap, although maybe I am cheap. I simply don't want to spend any money, so I'm just looking for things that are quote unquote a deal. But you have to. It requires a critical moment, because you got to say, well, if I really need that, can I do without it? Can I adapt this or modify it or fix it? Because often things that are damaged get put in the clearance bin. And can I fix this and hence gain the advantage of, for example, $100+ purse for $5, which I did at one moment. This is an easy fix. In short, value is a concept. Rather, value is, as the second view sees, not given prior to its concept, but at the same time, as the first view would like, out there, objectively present to consciousness prior to its reflection and thought. So this is a little procedure that goes on. It's Hegelian in that sense. In short, value is a concept, hence not originally our concept. For such a concept to be really present, the moments of value have to be distributed over its material bearers, namely commodities and money. This idea is perhaps the most novel and difficult of what I here propose. There is no given of which one forms a concept, namely the concept of value. Rather, value is a concept given to us from practice, having been generated behind our backs. Value is a concept objectively presented to us in the circuit of capital. It's not through some externally applied method that the nature of capital is identified and defined. But, capital defines its own identity through the circuit of the determinations of its concept that it itself presents. That sounds a little complicated, but, the simple ways to talk about social constructionism or critical realism, there are determinations of concepts that are presented to us. And how are they presented to us? They are presented to us, not because we make them up out of whole cloth, but rather our experience brings those, our history brings those to us. And so therefore, hence the need for historical materialism is that you need to get a sense of history in order to make proper or better judgments, to combine our consciousness not only within ourselves, but collectively with others to proceed in a better human fashion. Okay, that's all I have to say. I'm exactly at 6:01.
Just
Um,
in time.
you you can talk now, but we'll just allocate a few minutes simply because we've got to prepare for it. At 7 o'clock. We're going to have after hours, and then um, a little later after that, at 8:30, we're going to have Twilight Zone. John, are you here to tell us about Twilight Zone?
I am here. So tonight on the Twilight Zone, we have Richard Basehart.
Ooh, voyage to the
Bring,
bottom of the sea.
yeah, and also the voice of um, David Hasselhoff's boss in Knight Rider.
Talking car. Kit.
Well, not Kid, but the guy he's supposedly working for. Or, I don't know.
Oh,
He,
because
Kit
he's
was the
William
car, right?
Daniels is the word
Kid,
or is the voice.
Kid was the car. Yeah, no, that was a
The
different
dude with
voice,
the
but
mustache.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we have Antoinette Bauer and Harold Gould in tonight's Twilight Zone, and that's all I'm going to say.
Exciting.
Exciting.
Looking forward to it.
Just a little
Um,
food teaser for later. I
yes.
just got out to the farm, busy moving day. Didn't have much, just threw some things around. I got instant ramen. So I'll be making mie goreng, like Indonesian or Malaysian style
Yum.
fried noodles. Instead of
Yum.
soup, we'll make fried noodles. Got the wok all set up.
Yum. Mie goreng. Exciting. Tasty.
As long as you're not using oil, Joe.
Oh, you didn't see that. You didn't see that.
What type of oil are you using?
Oh, I'm using, let's see, sunflower oil, but you can
Mm.
use peanut, you can use avocado, neutral oil with a high burn point.
Yep.
I use that
Explosion.
10W30.
We're not deep frying the noodles, we're just frying the noodles, like kind of saute, stir fry noodles.
Stir
So
fry.
it's a Southeast Asian version of chow mein.
Yes. Yum. The perfect comfort food.
Oh wait, so I'm an hour early, or we're starting now?
No, no, we're starting in an hour.
Oh, okay,
We're
then I
we're
can go chill.
56 minutes away.
So have you got
Larry
indoor
has a
mine?
question.
Like the
Larry
indoor
has
mine noodles, Joe.
yeah.
These are Mama, I think,
Yes.
Indomie. Yes, you might know these.
Yes, very good.
We'll get all to that in office in after hours in an hour.
All
We'll
righty.
go.
And yes, to remind you that after Twilight Zone tonight, I think we're going to look at. I think we're going to follow the original production plan of Prisoner, but we're going to watch whatever the the next episode of Prisoner is.
Excellent.
Quick question on that UPS construct. That's called a syllogism?
No, a syllogism is just a part of this. A syllogism is a tool by which we can put these things together. It's the sequence.
Okay, what's the shortcut for the
Ah,
I mean, is there a name for that? UPS?
finite purpose, particularity, syllogism. I don't know. It's a model for reality.
Yeah, I'll use UPS to start with.
Well, UPS is easy to remember, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Universality, particularity, syllogism of many. We perform various elements like this. So if you were following the history of phenomenology, you would be performing in the phenomenological spirit kind of terms a what's called a quote unquote phenomenological reduction on these things. It's trying to seek knowledge, right? In the in the Platonic cave sense, right? You're looking at shadows, and then you try and find, oh, well, actually they're dummies that give you the shadows, and then
Oh, like deduction.
yeah.
Okay.
Or search for knowledge.
Fascinating.
It's a schema of schematism of the syllogistic structure.
Wow.
Well, I mean, it's a Stanford diagram, so it's got to be good, right?
And Ferd, F-E-R-D.
Yes, but only Berkeley graduates use that construction. Okay, I hope I answered your question there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
If you want the full explanation of it is under Hegel's dialectic in the Stanford, whatever it is, of philosophy.
Zizek.
Called Plato is what it's called, the site.
Okay.
Anybody else? Brickbats? Interventions? Okay, let's we do this and that at 5 o'clock every weekday. On weekends, 3 o'clock on Saturdays, with weekly Marx at 3 o'clock on Sundays, which is hopefully going to alter itself for 15 some odd weeks into something slightly different on discussion of the subprime mortgage debacle. Yeah, I'm here. I'll be back at in less than an hour. To yammer about other matters, and we'll look at some Migoreng with because then I'll get hungry again, and amongst other things. So thank you very much.